بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، حمدا كثيرا طيبا مباركا فيه، والصلاة والسلام الأتمان الأكملان على خير خلق الله أجمعين، وعلى آله وصحبه ومن اهتدى بهديه واستنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما، وأرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه، وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه، وجعلنا ممن يستمعون القول فيتبعون أحسنه. أما بعد، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. I welcome you to this session of our class, Al-Aqeedah Al-Tahawiyah by Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala. And in our last class, we had started on the next قاعدة, القاعدة السادسة, the sixth rule concerning the attributes of Allah. And basically, we had mentioned that this rule pertains to what is the correct standard by which one knows what is permissible and what is not permissible with regards to Allah. Knowing what is permissible and what is not permissible with regards to Allah, meaning in terms of al-ithbat wal nafi, in terms of what we affirm and what we negate from Allah, in terms of what we affirm and what we negate from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And basically here, Ibn Taymiyyah is refuting the mutakallimun, who basically said that the way to affirm, or the way that the standard that we should use is simply nafi at-tashbih, nafi at-tashbih, to negate similarity, to negate any similarity between Allah and His creation. And so we continue from where we left off last week. We'll continue from where we left off. And we'll try to get as much as we can get done of this sixth rule, but we won't be able to complete it today. It's a very long chapter that Ibn Taymiyyah has included in this book, Al-Tadmuriyah. Perhaps I would say it is the longest of all the rules, these qawa'id, these 7 rules that he has mentioned. It is the longest, the lengthiest. So we'll try to do what we can, inshallah. And the second longest is the next one, number 7. All right. So Ibn Taymiyyah, he says, he says, وإنما المقصود هنا أن مجرد الاعتماد في نفي ما ينفى على مجرد نفي التشبيه لا يفيد، إذ ما من شيئين إلا ويشتبهان من وجه ويفترقان من وجه، بخلاف الاعتماد على نفي النقص والعيب ونحو ذلك مما هو سبحانه وتعالى مقدس عنه، فإن هذه طريقة صحيحة. Here he comes back to what he was talking about, because he goes on a lot of tangents, as we know, Ibn Taymiyyah. He usually goes on a lot of tangents. And so he says, coming back to the point that we were addressing, simply relying on negating tashbih when it comes to what is not permissible with regards to Allah. What is the standard? The standard we should use, he's talking about the mutakallimun. They say that the standard that we should use is nafi at-tashbih. And that's it. There should be no similarity between Allah and His creation. Right? Ibn Taymiyyah says only using this standard is problematic. Why? He says because between two things, there will always be some sort of tashbih. There will always be some sort of tashbih between two things. Right? There will always be some angle of tashbih, and there will be angles of differences. Right? Between every two things, there will be similarities, and there will be differences. As opposed, so basically, this is the standard used by the mutakallimun, right? And that's why they negated Allah's attributes, because that's all that they were focusing on, right? That there should not be any tashbih whatsoever, right? He says, as opposed to relying on something else, and that is nafi al-naqs wal-aib. Nafi al-naqs wal-aib. And other similar things that Allah is not to be attributed with. An-naqs wal-aib basically means deficiencies. Deficiencies and imperfection. Okay? Deficiencies and imperfection. This is what we should be using. This is the standard that we should be using. Ibn Taymiyyah says this is the correct standard. This is the correct method. Right? And then he further explains it. He says, وَكَذَلِكَ إِذَا أَثْبَتَ لَهُ صفات الكمال ونفى مماثلة غيره له فيها فإن هذا نفي المماثلة فيما هو مستحق له وهذا حقيقة التوحيد وهو ألا يشركه شيء من الأشياء فيما هو من خصائصه. So here he explains the correct standard to use. And he says, so when it comes to negation, the correct standard to use is by saying we negate from Allah all deficiencies and imperfection. Right? So the focus is not on tashbih, but rather on imperfection and deficiencies. And then he says, as for affirmation, what do we affirm for Allah? We affirm for Him attributes of perfection. And when we affirm those attributes of perfection, at the same time, this is where we are negating similarity, right? This is where we're negating similarity. So he says, here he's saying that we Ahlul Sunnah we're not saying that we don't negate tashbih, right? What we're saying is that when it comes to negation, what we should be focusing on is imperfection and deficiencies. That is what we're focusing on when it comes to negating from Allah anything, right? Where do we use negation of tashbih? When we affirm for Allah attributes. So he says that here, when you are negating similarity, when you affirm for Allah attributes of perfection, then you say that these attributes of perfection, there's no similarity between these attributes and the attributes of His creation. Why? Because you are affirming for Allah that which He deserves. And Ibn Taymiyyah says here, that is حقيقة التوحيد. That is a reality of Tawheed. And then he explains what is a reality of Tawheed. He says that no one should share with Allah in those things that are exclusive to Allah. So the reality of Tawheed is, as he says here, that no one should share with Allah in that which is exclusively His. And when you think about Tawheed, that's a reality of Tawheed in the various categories that we know. So Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, what is it? That Allah is the Rabb and no one shares with Allah in His exclusive right to being a Rabb and the qualities of Rububiyyah, like creation, providing, etc. No one shares with Allah in this exclusive right of His. Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, likewise, uh, Allah alone deserves to be worshipped. No one can share with Allah. You cannot share ibadah between Allah and others because it is His exclusive right. Asma wa Sifat, the same thing. Tawheed al-Asma wa Sifat, to Allah belong names and attributes that are exclusively His, right? And whatever we affirm for Allah of names and attributes, the realities of those names and attributes, no one shares. No one shares with Allah in those. Meaning, in the realities and the hows of those attributes, there is no similarity. There is no tashbih. He goes on to say, وَكُلُّ صِفَةٍ مِنْ صِفَاتِ الْكَمَالِ فهو متصف بها على وجه لا يماثله فيه أحد ولهذا كان مذهب سلف الأمة وأئمتها إثبات ما وصف به نفسه من الصفات ونفي مماثلته لشيء من المخلوقات. He says that every صفة of the صفات of perfection, then Allah is attributed with it. Meaning, to Allah belongs every attribute of perfection, but in a way that it does not resemble the attributes of His creation. And he says this was the madhab of the Salaf and their scholars. What was their madhab? What was their position on, al-asma wal-sifat? To affirm for Allah what He has described for Himself of attributes and to negate any similarity between any of those attributes, between what we attribute to Allah and what we attribute to His creation. What we attribute to His creation. So the point here is that this is the correct standard that we should use to know what to attribute to Allah and what not to attribute to Him, what to affirm for Him, what not to affirm for Him, right? And here now, Ibn Taymiyyah is going to go on to he's going to go on to refute the argument, the counter argument now that the mutakallimun will bring forward. Okay, he says, فإن قيل إن الشيء إذا شابه غيره من وجه جاز عليه ما يجوز عليه من ذلك الوجه ووجب له ما وجب له وامتنع عليه ما امتنع عليه. He says, here he's addressing or he's mentioning the argument, right? He's mentioning the argument here that affirming similarity in terminologies, in names, implies tashbih. So he says, if it is said that something resembles another thing in a certain aspect, if one thing resembles another, even in one aspect, then what is permissible for that thing must be permissible for the first, from that aspect. And whatever is obligatory for that thing must be obligatory for the other. And whatever is impermissible for that thing must also be impermissible for the other. Now, these are philosophical terminologies that the mutakallimun have, basically they use these terminologies that they've taken from philosophy, right? Um, and that is that everything uh, can be either attributed with what is yajuz for it, what is permissible for it, or what is wajib for it, what is obligatory for it, or what is mumtani', what is mumtani', what is not possible for it, right? So, for example, human beings, it is permissible for us to be um, it is permissible, part of our existence is that it is permissible for us for our life to come to an end, right? For our life to come to an end. Uh, and for Allah, that is not permissible, right? For Allah, that is not permissible. So that is what we say, mumtani'a anillah. It is not permissible for that to happen to Allah. But it is yajuz for the creation, right? Etc. Right? So basically, what they're saying is that since there is some similarity, then there has to be similarity between the creation and the creator. What are they talking about similarity? They're talking about, here we're coming back to what Ibn Taymiyyah mentioned in the very beginning, and that is similarity in names and terminologies, right? Similarities in names and terminologies. So how does Ibn Taymiyyah address this argument of the mutakallimun? By mentioning the same things that he mentioned previously, right? Uh, by mentioning the same things that he mentioned previously. So he goes on to respond to this argument. uh, he says that, Allah is attributed as being mawjood. He is existing. And human beings and the creation also exists. In fact, Allah has named some of his creation with names that he has given to himself. Again, you would recall the same argument that he used previously. So Allah refers to himself as Alim, and he also refers to the creation as being Alim, knowledgeable. Allah refers to himself as being Sami' and Basir, hearing and seeing, and he also attributes hearing and seeing to human beings, etc. Um, so that proves that just because we share in the names and the terminologies, it doesn't mean that there's tashbih, because then you're accusing Allah of, you know, of you're accusing Allah of having done tashbih when He Himself refers to His creation with these names, right? Um, so this is what we call al-qadr al-mushtarak. This is what we call al-qadr al-mushtarak, and we addressed this in detail previously. It was at the very beginning of the book that Ibn Taymiyyah addressed this issue of al-qadr al-mushtarak, that there is that bit, there is that small bit which there is similarity, and that is only in names. That is only in names. Uh, and here he goes on to mention the same thing that he mentioned previously, that this al-qadr al-mushtarak, right, it is only the same before it is attributed to something, right? So for example, um, life, life, al-hayat, right? Um, before you attribute it to someone, everyone understands the meaning of it. But it doesn't exist in the real sense until you apply it to a being, right? Before you apply it, before you attribute it to a being, it remains a concept in the mind, right? Al-hayat, life, is a concept that is only in the mind, right? If it is not attributed to anyone, if it is not attributed to anyone, then it hasn't come, it hasn't come out in the real sense. So before you attribute it to someone, yes, of course, there is, there is that tashbih, or that is the qadr mushtarak. That is the bit that we share. But once you apply it, then we know that this hayat, this life, is different based on who you applied it to. So when you say the life of Allah and you say the life of a human being, now there is no resemblance, right? Now there is no tashbih. The tashbih was there before applying it. And that's what Ibn Taymiyyah says here. He says that before you apply it, there's no that's where there's tashbih, right? But once you've applied it, there's no tashbih, because when you say the life of Allah, now it is restricted to Allah, and that is a kind of life that is exclusive to Allah. No one shares that kind of life with Allah, right? So how do we describe the life of Allah? That it is eternal. It has no beginning, it has no end. And that is something that cannot be described for anyone else. So every other life that is attributed to someone, to a being, it is a life that was preceded by non-existence, and it will be followed by death. It is a life that will be followed by death, by an end, right? Um, so here, basically, that's what he's saying, that once it is applied, once the attribute is applied, then we have, you know, uh, that which is exclusive to Allah of those attributes, and that which is exclusive to the creation. And in this way, there is nothing wrong with affirming these attributes for Allah. There is nothing wrong with affirming these attributes for Allah. He says, rather, we say that they must be affirmed for Allah, right? They must be affirmed for Allah, because if you don't affirm these attributes for Allah, then you're falling into ta'til. Uh, you're falling into absolute ta'til. Absolute ta'til. As we know, ta'til is to deny a lot of attributes, to strip him of attributes. And by not affirming these attributes for Allah, then it implies that you also have to say he does not exist. So even the attribute of existence, al-wujud, right? You have to say that he doesn't exist. Because if you attribute to him wujud, existence, then the creation is also attributed with wujud, right? And again, this is something that Ibn Taymiyyah mentioned earlier on as well. Um, and Ibn Taymiyyah says here, وَلِهَذَا لما اطلع الأئمة على أن هذا حقيقة قول الجهمية سموهم معطلة وكان جهم ينكر أن يسمى الله شيئا وربما قالت الجهمية هو شيء لا كالأشياء فإذا نفى القدر المشترك مطلقا لزم التعطيل التام. He says, this is why when the scholars, the imams of the past, we're talking about, after the generations of the Salaf, the likes of Imam Ahmad and Imam al-Bukhari, etc., when they looked at the reality of the positions of the Jahmiyyah, they called them mu'attila. They referred to the Jahmiyyah as being mu'attila, people of ta'til, right? And he says that Jahm ibn Safwan, used to deny, he used to say that we cannot call Allah shay'an, a thing. We cannot refer to Allah as a shay', as a thing. And he says others among the Jahmiyyah may say, he is a thing, huwa shay' la kal ashya. They may say that you can refer to him as a thing, but not like other things. Not like other things. And what they mean by this is, nafi tashbih. What they mean by this is that he cannot have attributes, right? He cannot have attributes. And that's why Ibn Taymiyyah says here, what does he say? He says, here, whoever denies al-qadr al-mushtarak, right? Al-qadr al-mushtarak, the name, of wujud, for example, or shay', as in this example, then what that necessitates is ta'til, absolute ta'til, ta'til التام, التعطيل التام. Now, just a point here about the term shay'. Since Ibn Taymiyyah mentioned it here, are we allowed to say that Allah is a thing or not? We say Allah has referred to this in the Quran, in Surah Al-An'am. In Surah Al-An'am, Allah says, قُلْ أَيُّ شَيْءٍ أَكْبَرُ شَهَادَةً قُلِ اللَّهُ. قُلْ أَيُّ شَيْءٍ أَكْبَرُ شَهَادَةً قُلِ اللَّهُ. Say to them, O Muhammad, what thing, أَيُّ شَيْءٍ, what thing is a greater testimony? What is the greatest testimony of Allah and His oneness, etc.? Allah commands the Prophet ﷺ to say Allah. قُلْ Allah. Say Allah is the greatest testimony, right? So what is that thing which is the greatest testimony? Say Allah, right? So Allah refers to Himself as a thing, right? A shay'. However, the scholars say that these kinds of attributes, we do not refer to them as attributes, nor as names, right? They say هذا من باب الإخبار or من باب الخبر, not من باب التسمية. So Allah is just informing us of something, and we do not call Allah by that. So, for example, we don't say, Ya Allah, Ya Shaykh, right? We don't say, Oh Allah, Oh thing, right? Nor even do we refer to Allah as mawjud, even though He exists. But we don't say, Ya mawjud, Oh the one who exists, right? So we have to be careful about this. Um, it is only used, we only use these names in this particular context um, when we are dealing with you know, um, the mutakallimun, and that's because they are the ones who brought these concepts up, right? They are the ones who brought these ideas up, so we have to refute them using what is mentioned in the Quran and what is also, logical as well. All right. After that, Ibn Taymiyyah, he goes on to mention that behind every attribute, there are its consequential results, right? Every attribute has consequential results. It has implications. It has, mandatory effects, right? Uh, so affirming the necessary results of attributes. That's what he's going to talk about here. And so he says, والمعاني التي يوصف بها الرب سبحانه وتعالى كالحياة والعلم والقدرة بل الوجود والثبوت والحقيقة ونحو ذلك تجب له لوازمها فإن ثبوت الملزوم يقتضي ثبوت اللازم. He says that the meanings of the attributes that are attributed to Allah, like life and knowledge and power, meaning ability, and also existence, right? Uh, and reality, that Allah is real, and other such attributes. He says we also have to uh, affirm their necessary results. Why? Because the presence of the necessary condition entails the existence of its consequences or its necessary results, right? If you have a particular condition, uh, that it must result in something, right? It must actually result in something. So Allah's attributes are not just attributes without effects, right? There are effects to them. So, for example, rahmah, Allah's attribute of mercy, it has an effect. It's not just something that is attributed to Allah without having an effect. And we see that effect on Allah's creation. We see the mercy of Allah here, right? Uh, now, why is he mentioning this? He says, وخصائص المخلوق التي يجب تنزيه الرب عنها ليست من لوازم ذلك أصلا بل تلك من لوازم ما يختص بالمخلوق من وجود وحياة وعلم ونحو ذلك والله سبحانه منزه عن خصائص المخلوق وملزومات خصائصه. He says that the attributes of the creation, right? Because this is the crux of the problem. This is the problem that the mutakallimun have. right? When we affirm these attributes for Allah, they say these are attributes that are affirmed for the creation. And there are negative uh, results from these attributes that are attributed to the creation. So, for example, um, the life of a human being, the life of a human being. Uh, how would you describe uh, this attribute of life when it comes to human beings? That it's deficient, it's imperfect, right? Uh, a human's life uh, is prone to sickness and illness and injury and death. These are all negative qualities, right? So these are the lawazim of that attribute. These are the necessary result from this attribute. Let's take knowledge, al-ilm, same thing. The knowledge of a human being is deficient. He doesn't know everything. One day he has knowledge, the other day he forgets, right? So that is the necessary implication, the necessary result, the necessary effect of affirming that attribute for a human being. So what they're saying, the mutakallimun, is that is why we cannot affirm these attributes for Allah. Why? Because of these necessary results, right? So Ibn Taymiyyah says that uh, these implications, these deficient implications, uh, with regards to the creation, that we cannot affirm for Allah, they are not from the necessary implications of Allah's attributes. They are not from the necessary implications of Allah's attributes, but rather they are the necessary implications and results of human attributes, whether it be wujud, existence, hayat, life, or ilm, knowledge, etc. And Allah is, not to be attributed with what is exclusive for his creation, right? What is exclusive for the creation? These negative effects. And Allah does not share in that, right? Ibn Taymiyyah, he goes on to say that, this point here, that if someone was to really understand very well, then all of these shubuhat will go away. He says, وهذا الموضع من فهمه فهما جيدا وتدبره زالت عنه عامة الشبهات وانكشف له غلط كثير من الأذكياء في هذا المقام وقد بسط هذا في مواضع كثيرة. He says that whoever understands this can contemplate over this point very well, all of these shubuhat that the mutakallimun bring regarding Allah's names and attributes, they'll be resolved for him, right? And many intelligent people, he's referring to, some of the intelligent among the mutakallimun. He says many of these shubuhat that affected them will not affect you. Even though you're not as smart as them, you're not as intellectual as them. And he says we have explained this elsewhere. And he goes on to explain once again the idea of al-qadr al-mushtarak, al-kulli, the absolute qadr mushtarak, the names, before they are attributed to anyone, we understand what they mean. So we understand what is life, what is existence, what is knowledge, right? But that doesn't have any implications until you attribute it to a being, right? So these necessary lawazim, these necessary results from the attributes, they only come into effect after you attribute them to someone, right? But before that, they're just a concept in the mind, right? They're just a concept in the mind. Um, yeah, and so he says every single existing being has attributes that have consequences, that have necessary results, but those necessary results only come into effect after you have attributed the attribute to them. So when you say the life of a human being, now you understand that it has X, Y, and Z in terms of necessary implications that are deficient. But when you say the life of Allah, those same, you know, those same uh, necessary effects that were for the human being do not apply to Allah. They do not apply to Allah, right? So when you say the life of Allah, you understand that it is a life that has no imperfection in it, that has no deficiency in it whatsoever. That's basically what he's trying to say here. After that, Ibn Taymiyyah, he goes on to mention how the mutakallimun uh, in their various groups, uh, they had a lot of contradictions among themselves. Um, so he mentions how, you know, some of them think that affirming that qadr mushtarak implies a tashbih, right? And they will use that to negate all of Allah's attributes, right? Why? Because, as he says here, حذرا من ملزومات التشبيه. Because he doesn't want to apply to Allah those uh, those necessary results that we mentioned, implications of human attributes. And he says others. So here he's talking about the Jahmiyyah and the Mu'tazila. The Jahmiyyah and the Mu'tazila, who negated all of Allah's attributes, right? He says, and other times, some of them, they will realize that no, we have to uh, we have to affirm that qadr mushtarak for certain attributes. Hmm? So here he's referring to the Ash'ari and the Maturidiyah who affirmed some attributes for Allah, right? The seven attributes. So, they say, just like we say, that qadr mushtarak, you have to affirm. You have to admit that there is that bit that we share with Allah. The name of ilm, the name of the name of existence, of hearing, of seeing, right? But then we say to them, right, the Ash'ari and also the Maturidiyah, we say to them, then be consistent, right? Be consistent and use that for all of Allah's attributes. Right? And the Mu'tazila also, they will refute the Ash'ari in the same way. They will say, be consistent. Right? Why is it that you've chosen some attributes and not all of them? Be consistent like us. right? And we say the same thing to them. Be consistent like us, right? Remember the golden rule in the beginning. Whatever we say about some of Allah's attributes applies to all of them. Whatever we say about some of Allah's attributes applies to all of them. After this, Ibn Taymiyyah mentioned some philosophical questions. He addresses some philosophical questions, um, and these questions came up as a result of, as he says, وَلِكَثْرَةِ الْإِشْتِبَاهِ فِي هَذَا الْمَقَامِ وَقَعَتِ الشُّبْهَةِ. Right? So he's mentioning that they differed. The mutakallimun, they differed among themselves, ahlul kalam, because, in the end of the day, all of their arguments are based on what? They are all based on philosophical arguments. Philosophical and logical arguments that have no basis in the Sharia, right? And this is the entire problem, right? This is the entire problem. When they delved into ilm al-kalam, if they didn't do that, then we wouldn't be where we are today, right? If the various groups of the past refrained from ilm al-kalam, we wouldn't have this entire discussion, right? We wouldn't have this entire discussion. And it was as a result of the works of the ancient Greek philosophers being translated into Arabic in the period of the Abbasi Khulafa. They thought that there was some good in these philosophical works. Let's get them translated into Arabic and have our scholars to look into them, right? And that's when they took what they felt is beneficial, right? And they took that to address philosophical issues, in our deen, right? And that is Aqeedah related issues. And then this is where we have what we call ilm al-kalam, ilm al-kalam. And that's the difference between philosophy and ilm al-kalam. Philosophy is foreign to Islam, right? Philosophy is foreign to Islam. Ilm al-kalam, they somehow tried to figure out a way to, merge between philosophy and our aqeedah. But it is foreign. Even ilm al-kalam is foreign to our aqeedah. And that's why the scholars from among the Salaf and those who came after them warned severely against delving into ilm al-kalam and studying it and using it to deduce aqeedah related issues. There are many, many statements of the scholars of the past, of that time, that era, from among the Salaf and those who came after them, warning against delving into ilm al-kalam. And as we mentioned last week, it was the Mu'tazila who really championed ilm al-kalam. And Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, as we mentioned, initially he was one of them, but then he left and he started refuting them, right? And towards the end of his life, he realized that I should have stayed away from ilm al-kalam even when refuting the Mu'tazila, right? And he says, now I towards the end of my life, I am upon the same deen and aqeedah as the scholars of hadith, right? Here he's talking about the scholars of hadith of that era, the likes of Imam al-Bukhari and Imam Ahmad and others. And this continued, so the early Ash'aris, so his students, his ashab, his students, and those who came after them, there's a huge difference between them and those who came later from the Ash'ari, where the early Ash'ari, we're talking about the students of Imam al-Ash'ari, they actually affirmed Allah's attributes. We're talking about all of them, and also the attributes related to actions, right? It was later on when there was some animosity between the scholars of Hadith or the Hanabila and some of the Ash'aris. Then each group, to champion their position, they kind of went to extremes. So you did have some Hanabila, some scholars from the Hanabila, who went to extremes in affirmation, to say that, Allah sits on his throne, for example. This is wrong. But they did that to refute the Ash'ari. And the Ash'ari, some among them, wanted to refute these Hanabila. So they resorted to ilm al-kalam, right? They resorted to ilm al-kalam. And one of these individuals was Imam al-Haramain, al-Juwayni. Al-Juwayni, who is a very senior figure among the Ash'ari. He was one of the first to go back to ilm al-kalam and reintroduce it into the Ash'ari creed. And he actually, it's mentioned that he went and studied ilm al-kalam from the Mu'tazila. He had Mu'tazili scholars who he learned ilm al-kalam from. But otherwise, prior to that, we're talking about a century, those who attributed themselves to Imam al-Ash'ari, during that period of time before Juwayni came, they were scholars of hadith. They were respected scholars of hadith. The likes of al-Baqillani, Imam al-Bayhaqi, right? Al-Bayhaqi, and others, right? But then Al-Juwayni came, and then after him Al-Razi came, and also, really delved into ilm al-kalam. And Ibn Taymiyyah came after Al-Razi, and he basically, Ibn Taymiyyah, focused on Razi and his arguments. There's an entire book that Ibn Taymiyyah authored refuting one of the books of Imam al-Razi, right? Naqd al-Ta'sis. So anyways, here Ibn Taymiyyah mentions some philosophical questions that that the Mu'tazila and the Ash'ari debated over. Some philosophical questions, like is the existence of Allah, is it his very essence, or is it something more than his very essence? And for example, is something non-existing, do we refer to it as a shay, as something, or not? Al-ma'dum, something that doesn't exist. Do we say that it is a shay, a thing, or not? Right? Etc. Like, very philosophical questions that, a Muslim doesn't really need, right? That he doesn't really need. And here Ibn Taymiyyah, he goes on to, talk about these questions and, address them. And we won't really get into them, but at the very end he says, وَأَمَّا هَذِهِ الْجُمَلَ الْمُخْتَصَرَةِ فَإِنَّ الْمَقْصُودِ بِهَا التنبيه على جمل مختصرة جامعة من فهمها علم قدر نفعها وانتفح له باب الهدى وإن كان إغلاق باب الضلال ثم بسطها وشرحها له مقام آخر إذ لكل مقام مقام. He says whoever understands these concepts, And, because he didn't delve into the answers to these philosophical questions, but he only mentioned them briefly. He mentioned the answers to these questions briefly. And then in the end, he says, whoever understands this, it's good. But the details, this is not the place for it. The details, this is not the place for it. And he has discussed the details of these in other works of his. He says, والمقصود هنا أن الاعتماد على مثل هذه الحجة فيما ينفى عن الرب وينزه عنه كما يفعله كثير من المصنفين خطأ لمن تدبر ذلك وهذا من طرق النفي الباطلة. He says, the point here is that relying on such arguments to negate from Allah whatever is negated, like some authors have done. So here he's probably talking about Al-Razi and others. He says this is completely wrong, whoever, reflects over it. And this is from the methods of incorrect nafi, incorrect nafi, incorrect incorrect negation. What is he talking about? He's talking about the standard used by the mutakallimun that we spoke about earlier. That when it comes to Allah, we should only focus on nafi at-tashbih, only negating similarity. That should be the focus. But as he explained, this is not the correct method. This is not the correct standard to use, but rather the correct standard to use is, as he mentioned, nafi an-naqs wal-aib, to negate any imperfection and deficiency for Allah. And this is where we'll stop. After that, he mentions a sub chapter here. And so we'll continue next week from here, insha'Allah ta'ala. If there are any questions, we could take those, or we could wrap up, insha'Allah. The question is, if the earliest students of Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari affirmed all of Allah's attributes, in which aspects did their aqeedah differ from Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah? There wasn't much difference between those early Ash'aris, but just on certain smaller, minor issues. Um, so there was still some reliance on ilm al-kalam and using logical arguments. But these major differences that exist now, or that came into effect later on, they were not there, in that time. They were not there in that time, and that's why we consider, these scholars to be scholars of Ahlul Sunnah, the likes of Imam al-Bayhaqi, for example, right? Even though the Ash'aris, they'll use that against us. They'll say, look, Imam al-Bayhaqi was a scholar of Hadith, he's a scholar of Ahlul Sunnah, and he was an Ash'ari. So we respond to that by saying that he was not the kind of Ash'ari that, the later Ash'aris became, where they are, negating, or they are only affirming 7 attributes, right? Imam al-Bayhaqi has a book called As-Sifat, the Sifat of Allah, where he affirms these attributes that the later Ash'ari negated from Allah. And as we mentioned, Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari himself went through 3 stages, right? He went through 3 stages, and that last stage of his life, that was what he died upon, and that was, coming back to the aqeedah of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah in its totality. In its totality. and Allah knows best. All right, we'll end here, inshallah, and we'll see you next week, bi'idhnillah. Subhanak Allahumma wa bihamdik. أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك وصل اللهم وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.